Castlevania Lords of Shadow series continues to surprise me. The first game was not as bad as I had thought. There were some mixed feelings there, but this other one on the 3DS, the Mirror of Fate one, it's actually a really good game, which surprised me a lot. Welcome back, classy crew, to another Castlevania Diary, the 26th entry against my very first pledge to play this entire franchise. Now, after this entry, there are only 2 Castlevania games remaining, Lords of Shadow 2, which I'm not looking forward to, and Castlevania Judgment, which I think is a fighting game. This game, Castlevania Lord of Shadows, Mirror of Fate, I played the HD version on Steam, and I was pleasantly surprised at what kind of game there was here. In fact, it was developed by Mercury Steam, the very same studio that did Metroid Samus Returns, the remake, and Metroid Dread more recently. And you can really see that some of the concepts and the mechanics and the feel that is present in this game transferred over to those Metroid projects because they feel very similar. And the fact that they're both Metroidvanias feels even more like in line that they pretty much took this as the skeleton to build Metroid games. Starting with like the aesthetic of the game, it just looks beautiful. So they're I don't know what they're using. It's like a 2D, for the cutscenes, it's like a 2D sprite work, for lack of a better word, or like cell shaded graphics, maybe that's the better term. It works perfectly for this game. And then the actual game, the sprite, the characters, the background, look absolutely beautiful, especially in the HD version. I don't know what it looks like on the 3DS version, but I assume it's much more low res. There were times where I was just stopping to admire the background work on like the artwork, because it was just so beautiful. The next element was the combat. So you get introduced to that very early on. And it's pretty simplistic, especially when you compare it to the other Castlevania games. There are quite a few combos. I didn't find myself leaning too much into them. So as you level up your character, you do unlock more combos. But for the most part, it's pretty much you just spam a button. You have 2 buttons. You've got like your basic like whip, and then you have your AoE whip, which is like your strong attack. And so you're playing between those 2. You have your sub weapon, which we all know I don't use often. It's not that I don't like it, as I don't think about it. And through most of the game, I was able to get through by pretty much just... And then you have a block attack, which is quite generous, that lets you block any monster attack unless they flash, at which point you have to get out of the way. So it's a pretty nice, simple mechanic of attack, block, or... The story is where it gets really weird, and this game takes place, I think, after the first Lord of Shadows, because something pretty critical happens to your main character in the first game that they are in that state in this game. And I'm trying to be a little bit spoiler light here, not reveal too much. But basically the game is broken into 4 parts story-wise, and you're going to be playing as 4 different characters. The first one is Gabriel, so you start off the game as Gabriel, same character that you play in the first Lord of Shadow games. Then you're going to be playing as some of his descendants, which is very Castlevania-esque, if you will. You will play as Simon, his grandson, which is not a spoiler. There's different elements, mechanics to all of these playstyles, and the story all intertwines in a weird and definitely not satisfying way. I will just say that. The third part is you play as Alucard, but not the Alucard you might think from the past games, a very different type of Alucard who also uses a whip and not a sword. And then you play as Trevor Belmont, who is Gabriel's son and Simon's father. So you play as 4 different characters. They all share the same level. So if you level, let's say, Simon to level 10, when you start playing as Alucard, he'll be at level 10 with all the same mechanics. Each of these characters have different different items that you can get, and different ability upgrades, which does change up the gameplay throughout the game. It's a very Metroidvania light, I would say. The types of power-ups you get, of course, you get your double jump eventually, your like speed run and all that, but you get maybe 1 or 2 ability upgrades per character, and it doesn't feel as expansive as, say, a Metroid game or a Hollow Knight, where you're like picking up a lot of different abilities, exploring this massive map. It's not like that. It's a lot smaller and compact. In fact, I was able to finish this game in about 8 hours, going at a pretty comfortable pace, and I ended up with 75% completion. I think you could probably 100% this game in 10 to 12 hours. So it's a nice little like light Metroidvania to hold you over between games. It's actually quite perfect. So the story is, it gets you moving along. Don't get too invested in it. The whole Lord of Shadow story arc anyway is kind of weird, and it just gets so weird here. They're trying to do like plot twists for the sake of doing plot twists. It has nothing to do with the rest of the Castlevania canon. It has nothing, even like the Netflix show borrows nothing of Lord of Shadows as far as I know. So just Don't worry about the story. Just play it for the game that it is and enjoy it. The bosses I really enjoy. The bosses all have different phases, and they're perfect because you get just enough time in each phase to like really figure out what their pattern is. Then you can exploit it, and it doesn't drag on too long, where once you've figured out how to exploit it, they change it up, and then you have to pretty much learn the new gimmick at the like first phase and second phase of the fight. Also, unlike typical Castlevania games, this game is super generous with checkpoints. You die on a boss, don't worry, you're gonna get revived wherever you were on that boss. If you were in phase 2, you get to restart right in phase 2 with a little bit of health, and it's perfect. So this game really doesn't punish you too much. I was playing it on normal mode. There are, I think, 2 more difficulty modes, which I did not try. So for those of you who might want more of a difficult Castlevania experience, which is more like in line with the classic ones, I would say you might want to explore those, but I really enjoyed my normal playthrough. It was just a nice, comfortable romp through Dracula's castle. There's also more puzzles here that I haven't really seen in past Castlevania games. There's like every kind of story chapter has one massive puzzle that requires some planning. It really feels almost like a puzzle pulled out of a Zelda dungeon and put in here. It doesn't feel out of place or anything. It just does change the pacing a little bit, and it's done sparingly enough that it just, you're like, oh, okay, a puzzle, I'll do this. There's one thing, I don't know if it was removed from 3DS version. Remember, this game came out in the early 2010s when QuickTime events were all the thing. There's a lot of cutscenes that I feel were designed with QuickTime events in mind, but they got stripped out for some reason. They do show up towards the end of the game where you do have to do some minor QuickTime events, but it's very light, and it seems like there was a lot more at one point that just got thrown out for whatever reason. So they're there. They're a sign of the game's time, so I'm not going to knock it too much for it, and it does seem like the developers were conscious enough to remove it. There's also some parts, very few, where you can tell it was designed for the 3DS in mind, where the like camera's behind the character and things are coming at you. So in 3D, that would have been a really cool effect. But in the HD mode, you're just like, this is really weird. I mean, this would look really cool in 3D, I guess. So outside of the story, yeah, the only reason I would recommend this Castlevania is for that Metroidvania whipping like combat play style, and it's just a beautiful game to play through. The story doesn't mean much, but did the story really matter when you were playing Castlevania on the NES? Maybe to some degree, but mostly it was the gameplay. So Castlevania Lords of Shadow, Mirror of Fate, I do recommend it. It's a nice hidden gem, at least for me, because I have not heard anybody talk about it. Definitely a good game to pick up on the 3DS. And if you know nothing about Castlevania, definitely a good place to pick up. If you are a Castlevania enthusiast, you probably played this and you probably hate it. And if you haven't, just avoid it for the lore. Otherwise, I will see you on the next Castlevania Diary. Who knows when that will be, but we are almost at the end of this pledge. And until next time, keep it classy.